Pregnant black woman crashes. Lavish millionaire's wedding. Startling secrets revealed as bride flees. Dear family of Mr. Peter Stories, I know you've been eagerly waiting for another tale. And trust me, this one is going to be extra special. Crafted just for you. Get ready to dive into an adventure overflowing with excitement and joy. Don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss the warmth and magic we share in these stories. Stay tuned with endless love, Mr. Peter Stories. The morning sun cast golden fingers through the imported silk curtains of the Samuels Estate's bridal suite, where Clara Agnes stood before a three-panelled mirror worth more than most people's cars. Her reflection multiplied infinitely, showing every angle of the custom Vera Wang wedding gown that had been featured in Vogue before even touching her skin. The dress alone had caused a bidding war among fashion magazines for exclusive coverage rights of what society columns were already calling the wedding of the decade. Outside, an army of workers scurried across the mansion's 10-acre garden like elaborate ants, their movements choreographed by New York's most exclusive wedding planner. Thousands of white roses, each hand-selected for perfection, were being arranged in cascading archways. Crystal chandeliers hung from transparent marquees, their prisms throwing rainbow dances across the manicured lawn. The air was thick with the scent of roses, vanilla, and old money. Mrs. Samuels had spared no expense for her only son's wedding. The guest list read like a who's who of the Fortune 500, with 3 former presidents confirmed to attend. Private security teams patrolled the perimeter, their earpieces gleaming as they monitored for unwanted paparazzi or uninvited guests. Every detail had been planned, vetted, and executed with military precision. Clara's fingers trembled as she smoothed down the impossibly expensive fabric of her gown. The tremors had nothing to do with typical bridal jitters and everything to do with the text message she'd received last night. An unknown number had sent her a single photo. Marlon and a stunning black woman caught in an intimate embrace, dated just 6 months ago. The woman's face had haunted Clara's dreams, her eyes holding such love and trust that it made Clara's heart ache. Her soon-to-be mother-in-law breezed into the room, her Louboutins clicking against the marble floor like a metronome counting down to destiny. "Darling, you look absolutely perfect," Mrs. Samuels cooed, her voice dripping with the satisfaction of a woman who had orchestrated not just a wedding, but a merger of bloodlines and bank accounts. "Marlon won't be able to take his eyes off you." If only that were true, Clara thought, remembering how Marlon sometimes looked through her rather than at her. How he would occasionally call her Bella in his sleep, only to wake with such guilt in his eyes that it made her stomach churn. She had ignored these signs, these little breadcrumbs of truth, convincing herself that pre-wedding anxiety was making her paranoid. The wedding planner, Madison, burst in with an iPad, displaying real-time updates from various vendors. "The governor's security detail just arrived. The champagne is being chilled to exactly 42 degrees, and the symphony orchestra is doing their final sound check," she rattled off, her perfectly manicured fingers scrolling through endless checklists. "We're on schedule down to the second." Clara watched as an artist applied another layer of mascara to her already thick lashes, wondering if anyone would notice that she had been crying all night. The makeup artist had worked miracles, covering the dark circles under her eyes with expert precision. "You look like a princess," one of her bridesmaids sighed, and Clara felt her chest tighten. Princesses in fairy tales never had to deal with the ghost of their prince's past love. Through the floor-to-ceiling windows, she could see guests beginning to arrive. Women in designer dresses that cost more than houses floated across the lawn like exotic birds, their jewelry catching the sunlight. Men in bespoke suits clustered in groups, probably discussing merger opportunities and stock options, even on this supposedly romantic occasion. A string quartet began playing somewhere below, their music drifting up like a soundtrack to the elaborate performance this wedding had become. Clara recognized the piece, Pachelbel's Canon in D, classic and predictable, just like everything else about this day. Mrs. Samuels had chosen it, like she had chosen everything from the flowers to the font on the invitations, like she had chosen Clara for her son. The weight of the diamond tiara being placed on her head made Clara's neck ache. It was a Samuels family heirloom, worn by 4 generations of brides. As the hairstylist secured it with what felt like hundreds of pins, Clara caught Mrs. Samuels watching her with hawk-like intensity in the mirror. The older woman's smile didn't quite reach her eyes, which held the calculating look of a chess master about to call checkmate. 5 minutes until we need to head downstairs, Madison announced, her voice cutting through Clara's thoughts. The bridesmaids began their carefully rehearsed flutter of excitement, adjusting their identical champagne-colored dresses and checking their hair one last time. Each of them had been selected not for their friendship with Clara, but for their social connections and photogenic features. Clara stood, the weight of the dress settling around her like armor. The train, extending 15 feet behind her, rustled against the plush carpet like whispered secrets. A maid rushed forward to arrange it perfectly, her movements practiced from dozens of rehearsals. Another touched up Clara's lipstick, while a third adjusted the angle of the tiara by a fraction of an inch. The room buzzed with activity, but Clara felt strangely disconnected from it all, as if she were watching a movie of someone else's perfect day. Her phone lay heavy in a hidden pocket she had insisted the dressmaker add, her one small act of rebellion against Mrs. Samuels's total control. The mysterious photo seemed to burn through the fabric, demanding attention. Through the window, she spotted Marlon arriving in his custom-tailored tuxedo, his groomsmen flanking him like an honor guard. Even from this distance, she could see the tension in his shoulders, the way he tugged at his collar as if it were too tight. He looked like a man walking to a business meeting rather than his wedding. Perhaps in the world of the Samuels family, there was no difference. Mrs. Samuels clapped her hands, the sharp sound cutting through the controlled chaos like a knife. "Places, everyone! Places!" she commanded, and the room erupted into synchronized movement. Clara felt hands adjusting her veil, smoothing her dress, positioning her bouquet of rare white orchids just so. As she prepared to leave the bridal suite, Clara caught her reflection one final time. The woman staring back at her was beautiful, polished, and perfect. Everything the Samuels family had wanted. But in her eyes, visible only to herself, was a question that had been growing stronger with each passing hour. Was she about to make the biggest mistake of her life? The door opened, and the wedding coordinator gestured for her to follow. The string quartet had transitioned to the wedding march. 300 of the world's most influential people were waiting below. Cameras worth millions in exclusive rights were poised to capture every moment. And somewhere out there, a woman named Isabella held secrets that could bring this perfect day crashing down around them all. Clara took her first step forward, the weight of expectations pressing down harder than any diamond tiara. The perfect day was about to begin, or shatter into a million glittering pieces. A love born in shadows. Isabella Angel first met Marlon Samuels on a rainy Tuesday in September, 5 years before the ill-fated wedding. She was 17, helping her mother polish the grand staircase of the Samuels mansion, when he returned early from his boarding school in Switzerland. Their eyes met across the marble foyer, the heir to a billion-dollar fortune and the housekeeper's daughter, in a moment that would alter both their destinies forever. Unlike the other staff children who were required to use the service entrance, Isabella had grown up running through the mansion's hallways. Mrs. Samuels had initially allowed this only because Isabella's mother, Maria, was considered the finest housekeeper on the East Coast, and her happiness meant keeping the mansion running like a well-oiled machine. Young Isabella's presence was tolerated as a necessary inconvenience, at least until that rainy Tuesday. Marlon, soaked from the rain and rebelling against his mother's plans for him to attend law school, found himself drawn to the quiet girl with determined eyes who spent her evenings studying advanced placement textbooks in the kitchen after finishing her mother's housekeeping duties. He would slip away from his private tutoring sessions to sit with her, amazed by her dreams of becoming a doctor, her resilience, and her unwavering focus despite the circumstances life had dealt her. Their love story unfolded in hidden corners of the vast estate. Late-night conversations in the mansion's library, where Isabella would memorize medical terms while Marlon pretended to review business proposals. Secret meetings in the garden maze, where they shared their first kiss under a canopy of stars, their hearts beating in sync with the distant sound of waves from the private beach. Every stolen moment was a defiance of the social hierarchy that sought to keep them apart. Maria noticed the lingering glances between her daughter and the young master, but kept her counsel, torn between maternal concern and the practical knowledge that their worlds were too far apart. She had worked for the Samuels family long enough to understand that while they practiced polite tolerance in public, their private views on class and race remained firmly rooted in their old money mindset. Despite the odds, Isabella excelled in school, earning a full scholarship to Princeton's pre-med program. Marlon, under the guise of attending business meetings, would drive 3 hours each way just to spend stolen hours with her in small coffee shops far from his mother's prying eyes. They dreamed of a future together, making plans in whispers and writing promises in texts deleted immediately after reading. Their relationship deepened during those college years. Isabella's determination inspired Marlon to stand up to his family more, to question the path they'd laid out for him. He secretly helped fund medical outreach programs she was passionate about, watching with pride as she organized free clinics in underserved communities. In her, he found not just love, but a purpose beyond his family's legacy of mere wealth accumulation. The Samuels family's annual summer gala proved to be a turning point. Isabella, home from college and helping her mother coordinate the event, caught Mrs. Samuels' attention by correcting a wealthy doctor's diagnosis during casual conversation. The momentary look of approval in the family matriarch's eyes gave Marlon the courage to finally acknowledge their relationship publicly. That night, he kissed Isabella in front of 200 of New York's elite, declaring his love with the reckless abandon of someone who believed love could conquer all. Mrs. Samuels' reaction was swift and calculated. By morning, Maria was offered a retirement package that would set her up comfortably for life in Arizona. Isabella's medical school recommendations mysteriously began to fall through. Subtle whispers circulated through the hospital boards where the Samuels family held influence, whispers that could destroy a career before it began. Still, they fought for their love. Isabella applied to medical schools further away, while Marlon began secretly liquidating his trust fund assets. They planned to elope, to build a life away from his family's influence. But Mrs. Samuels had spent a lifetime protecting her family's legacy, and she wielded her power like a surgeon's scalpel, precise, cold, and absolutely lethal. The final confrontation came in Mrs. Samuels' study, where leather-bound books and oil paintings of stern ancestors watched as she laid out her terms. Isabella listened from the hallway, her heart breaking as she heard the threats, not just to her future, but to her mother's security, to the careers of everyone who had supported her journey, to the very medical outreach program she had built from scratch. That night, Marlon found Isabella in their secret spot in the garden maze. She was wearing his Harvard sweatshirt, the one he'd given her on their first anniversary. Her eyes were dry, but her voice shook as she told him they needed to end things. He argued, promised to protect her, swore they could find another way. But Isabella, daughter of a housekeeper who had taught her that practical love sometimes meant letting go, stood firm. What Marlon didn't know couldn't know as he watched her walk away was that Isabella carried more than just a broken heart from the maze that night. Their love had created something that would be impossible to hide in the coming months, something that would bring her back to the Samuels estate on another perfect day when white roses bloomed and crystal chandeliers caught the summer sun. 5 years of love, of dreams, of fighting against the current of social expectations ended in a single night. Within weeks, Mrs. Samuels had introduced her son to Clara Agnes, the perfect society bride, a woman whose family connections could further the Samuels empire. And Isabella, her heart shattered but her spirit unbroken, turned her focus to her medical studies, carrying a secret that grew heavier with each passing day. The shadow of their love lingered in the halls of the Samuels mansion, in the quiet corners where they had once whispered promises, in the garden maze where the stars still witnessed their ghosts. It lingered in Marlon's unconscious moments when he would call out for Bella in his sleep, and in Isabella's quiet determination as she prepared for the day she would finally reveal the truth that would shatter the perfect facade of the Samuels family forever. The ultimatum. The mahogany-paneled study of the Samuels estate had witnessed generations of life-altering decisions, but none quite like the scene unfolding on that bitter March evening. Marlon stood before his mother's imposing desk, his reflection fractured across the crystal decanter of aged bourbon she'd just poured. Outside, a late winter storm rattled the windows, as if nature itself was protesting what was about to transpire. Victoria Samuels sat in her leather chair like a queen upon her throne, her silver hair immaculately styled, her Cartier watch catching the light from the antique desk lamp. Her fingers, adorned with family heirloom rings, traced the edge of a thick manila envelope, a dossier that would change multiple lives forever. The room smelled of old books, power, and the subtle note of her signature Chanel perfume. "Darling," she began, her voice carrying the practiced warmth that had closed billion-dollar deals. "I've always taught you that love is a luxury, but legacy is a responsibility." She pushed the envelope across the polished desk. "Inside, you'll find everything you need to know about the consequences of continuing your association with Miss Angel." Marlon's hands shook as he opened the envelope. Photographs spilled out. Isabella volunteering at free clinics, her mother at church, her younger sister at dance recitals. Behind each image lay an implicit threat, each memory a potential casualty in this war of wills. But it was the documents that made his blood run cold. Acceptance letters to top medical schools, followed by draft letters rescinding those same acceptances. "Mother, you can't," he started, but Victoria raised a manicured hand, silencing him with the gesture that had cowed board members and politicians alike. "I can, and I will." She stood, walking to the floor-to-ceiling windows that overlooked the estate's grounds. "The Samuels name opens doors, darling, but it can just as easily close them. Every hospital board where Isabella might seek residency, every medical practice where she might work, we have connections to them all." She turned back to face her son, her expression softening with what she genuinely believed was maternal concern. "And it's not just her medical career. That charming little clinic where she volunteers, one word about mismanagement and their funding disappears. Her mother's retirement fund, the market can be so volatile. Her sister's dance scholarship, such a competitive field. The threats were delivered with the same tone she used to discuss the weather, each one a carefully aimed arrow finding its mark in Marlon's heart. He sank into one of the leather chairs, the weight of his family's influence crushing him. "The Agneses, on the other hand," Victoria continued, moving to pour herself another finger of bourbon, "are exactly what this family needs. Their shipping empire complements our technology holdings. Clara comes from the right background, understands our world. The marriage, she corrected herself with a slight smile, would create the largest private conglomerate on the East Coast. Thunder crashed outside as Marlon stood, his fists clenched. Isabella is brilliant, Mother. She's worked harder than anyone I know. She'll be an amazing doctor. She's the help's daughter, Victoria cut in, her voice sharp as a blade. Brilliant or not, some doors should remain closed. I've indulged this little romance long enough. She walked over to her son, placing a hand on his cheek in a gesture that felt both loving and threatening. You have until midnight to end it. Clean break, no explanations. If you don't, I'll be forced to make several calls tomorrow morning. The grandfather clock in the corner ticked loudly, counting down the moments until Marlon's deadline. Each chime seemed to echo the beating of his heart, growing heavier with each passing second. And if I walk away from the family, he challenged, though his voice wavered. If I choose her. Victoria's laugh was gentle, almost pitying. Darling, do you really think your trust fund is all we control? Every investment you've made, every business connection you've formed, they all lead back to this family. Walk away, and you'll have nothing to offer her except a name that I will personally ensure becomes synonymous with scandal. She returned to her desk, pulling out another document, a prenuptial agreement with Clara's name already printed on it. Sometimes love means sacrifice, my dear, but I'm offering you an empire in exchange for a childish fantasy. Think of what you and Clara could build together. Think of the legacy you could leave. Marlon stared at the prenup, his vision blurring. Images flashed through his mind. Isabella studying late into the night, her determination to help others, their secret moments in the garden maze. But alongside these memories came his mother's threats, each one a poisoned arrow aimed at everything Isabella had worked for. The storm outside grew fiercer as Victoria delivered her final blow. Isabella's mother, Maria, isn't it, has served us loyally for 20 years. It would break my heart to see her reputation questioned. One never knows what rumors might surface about missing items over the years, especially in households of our standing. You wouldn't, Marlon whispered, but he knew she would. His mother had built and protected their empire with the same ruthless determination she was now applying to his future. I've already had papers drawn up granting Maria a generous retirement package, Victoria continued smoothly. A villa in Arizona, full medical coverage, more than enough to live comfortably. She could watch her younger daughter grow up without worrying about making ends meet. Unless, of course, circumstances force me to reconsider. The implications hung heavy in the air. Marlon thought of Maria, who had bandaged his scraped knees and snuck him cookies when he was young, who had worked doubles to put Isabella through school, who didn't deserve to have her life destroyed because her daughter had fallen in love with the wrong man. Victoria walked to the door, pausing with her hand on the knob. Midnight, darling. Make the right choice. She left him alone in the study, the envelope of threats still scattered across the desk, the prenup lying like a sentence of execution beside them. Marlon pulled out his phone, looking at the last photo he and Isabella had taken together. They were at her volunteer clinic, both wearing scrubs, her eyes shining with purpose and love. His finger hovered over her number as the clock struck 11. An hour later, he stood in the rain outside Isabella's small apartment. When she opened the door, her smile faded at his expression. She tried to tell him something important, her hands trembling as she reached for him, but he cut her off. Better to make it quick, clean, a mercy killing of their dreams. The words fell like acid from his lips. My mother was right. We're from different worlds. This was never going to work. He turned away before she could see his tears, her devastating silence following him down the stairs. 2 weeks later, at a charity gala, Victoria introduced him to Clara Agnes. She was beautiful, accomplished, and came with a fleet of ships that would double the Samuel's transportation capabilities. When he kissed her hand, he pretended not to notice that his mother's smile looked more like a victor's smirk, What no one knew, as the society papers celebrated the upcoming merger of two great families, was that Isabella's unspoken words that night had been the most powerful ultimatum of all, one that would return to shatter the perfect facade of the Samuels empire on what should have been its crowning day. The moment of truth. The Cathedral of St. Patrick's had never looked more magnificent. Sunlight streamed through stained glass windows, casting rainbow shadows across faces of the most powerful people in the country. The air was heavy with the scent of white roses and anticipation. 300 guests held their collective breath as Reverend Matthews reached the most dramatic moment of any wedding ceremony. "If anyone objects to this union, speak now or forever. Hold your peace." The traditional words hung in the air like suspended crystal, fragile and threatening. Victoria Samuels allowed herself a small smile of triumph from her front row seat. After months of meticulous planning, years of careful manipulation, her vision was about to be complete. Clara stood at the altar, a vision in white, her Vera Wang gown catching the light like freshly fallen snow. Marlon stood beside her, straight-backed and proper, every inch the heir his mother had molded him to be. The pause lengthened as tradition demanded, 1 heartbeat, 2, 3. Then came the sound that would haunt Victoria Samuel's nightmares for years to come. The heavy wooden doors of the cathedral creaking open, sunlight blazed through the doorway, creating a dramatic silhouette. As eyes adjusted, gasps rippled through the congregation like a wave. There stood Isabella Angel, her dark skin glowing with an inner light, her belly swollen with unmistakable pregnancy. She wore a simple blue dress that only emphasized her condition, her hair falling in natural curls around her shoulders. The contrast between her elegant simplicity and the orchestrated opulence of the wedding could not have been more stark. Time seemed to freeze. Clara's bouquet trembled in her hands. Marlon's face drained of color so rapidly that his best man took a half-step closer, as if expecting him to faint. Victoria's fingers dug into the wooden pew hard enough to leave marks in the ancient oak. Isabella began walking down the aisle, her steps measured and deliberate. Unlike the hurried, dramatic entrance many might have expected, she moved with the dignity of someone who had carefully considered every aspect of this moment. Her high heels clicked against the marble floor, the sound echoing off the vaulted ceiling like a judge's gavel. Phones emerged from designer purses and custom suits, their cameras capturing what was quickly becoming the social scandal of the decade. Victoria's careful orchestration of press coverage was backfiring spectacularly. The exclusive photographers she'd hired were earning their exorbitant fees in ways she'd never imagined. As Isabella passed the midpoint of the aisle, details became clearer to the stunned guests. She was at least 7 months pregnant, her hand resting protectively over her belly. Her eyes never wavered from Marlon's face, though tears streamed freely down her cheeks. She wore no jewelry except for a simple silver chain, the one Marlon had given her on their first anniversary, the one he thought she'd returned along with his other gifts. The bishop shifted uncomfortably, his rigid adherence to ceremony warring with the unprecedented situation. The wedding planner had fainted dead away in the side chapel, her clipboard clattering to the floor in perfect acoustic accompaniment to the unfolding drama. Clara's bridesmaids, selected for their social connections rather than any genuine friendship, exchanged glances that mixed horror with poorly concealed delight. This would be talked about at every society event for the next decade. Several guests were already composing tweets in their heads. Isabella stopped exactly 3 steps from the altar. Even in her advanced pregnancy, she managed to carry herself with more grace than many of the socialites clutching their pearls in the pews. The cathedral's perfect acoustics ensured that every word would reach even the furthest corners of the vast space. Marlon swayed slightly, his hands opening and closing at his sides. The movement drew attention to the fact that he'd never put on his wedding ring during the ceremony. It lay forgotten on the sunny pillow held by his young cousin, the ring-bearer, who now stared at Isabella with undisguised fascination. Victoria started to rise, no doubt ready to summon security, but her husband Charles gripped her arm with surprising strength. His face held an expression she'd never seen in 40 years of marriage, a mixture of shame and resolution that froze her in place. The silence stretched, pregnant with possibilities, just as Isabella was pregnant with what everyone could now guess was a Samuel's heir. The only sound was the gentle passing of the summer breeze through the open cathedral doors, carrying with it the scent of the garden roses that had cost more than a year's salary for most people. Clara's father, shipping magnate Robert Agnes, watched the scene unfold with the calculating eye of someone who had built an empire by recognizing shifting winds. His hand moved subtly, and his personal security team melted away from the exits. Whatever was about to happen, he was choosing not to interfere. Various members of the Samuels family showed a range of reactions that spoke volumes about long-held suspicions. Aunt Margaret dabbed at her eyes with a handkerchief that cost more than Isabella's entire outfit, but her expression held more sympathy than shock. Uncle George, who had always criticized Victoria's iron-fisted control of the family, couldn't quite hide his satisfied smirk. The wedding guitarist, forgetting himself entirely, accidentally played a minor chord that perfectly captured the mood of the moment. The sound seemed to break the spell of silence, and the whispers began, a rising tide of muttered observations and exclamations that threatened to drown out whatever words were about to be spoken. But when Isabella finally spoke, her voice carried over the whispers with the same quiet strength she'd shown throughout medical school, throughout her years of loving Marlon in secret, throughout every obstacle Victoria had placed in her path. It was the voice of someone who had nothing left to lose, and therefore nothing left to fear. The truth was about to shatter more than just a wedding ceremony. It would crack the very foundation of the Samuels' empire, exposing the rot that lay beneath generations of carefully maintained appearances. In the heartbeat before Isabella's first word, the only person who seemed truly at peace was Isabella herself, as if finally, after months of carrying multiple burdens, she was about to lay them all down at the altar of truth. The baby chose that exact moment to kick, visible even through Isabella's dress, an unborn child already demanding to be part of its own story. The movement drew every eye in the cathedral, a reminder that this drama would have consequences that would last for generations to come. The scene was set, the players were in place, and in the next breath, secrets long buried under wealth and privilege would rise to the surface like bodies in a flood, changing the lives of everyone present in ways that no amount of money or social standing could prevent. Secrets unveiled. Isabella's voice rang through the cathedral with a clarity that seemed to silence even the whispers of the stained-glass angels above. "I tried to tell you that night," she began, her words carrying the weight of months of silent suffering. Every face in the cathedral turned toward her, drawn by the quiet power in her voice, the dignity in her bearing despite her tears. The sunlight streaming through the rose window above caught the crystal droplets on her cheeks, making them sparkle, like the diamonds adorning the society women who now sat transfixed. The baby moved again, as if lending strength to its mother's words, and Isabella's hand curved protectively over her swollen belly. "I tried to tell you about our baby," she continued, her eyes never leaving Marlon's increasingly pale face. "But you chose your mother's millions over even listening to me. You walked away that night, Marlon Samuels, not just from me, but from your child, your son." The words echoed off the vaulted ceiling like a thunderclap. Victoria Samuels' sharp intake of breath was audible in the perfect acoustics of the space. A male heir, the one thing she had been pressuring Marlon and Clara to provide as quickly as possible after their marriage. "You want to know something interesting about genetics, Mrs. Samuels?" Isabella's gaze shifted to Victoria, and suddenly her years of medical training became a weapon sharper than any society barb. Your family's distinctive green eyes, the ones you're so proud of, the ones that grace every portrait in your mansion's hall. They're caused by a dominant gene, a gene that will express itself in my child, your grandson, regardless of how hard you try to deny his existence. Victoria's hand flew to her throat, clutching her triple strand of pearls. The implications were clear to everyone present. There would be no hiding this child's parentage, no buying off this scandal. The next Samuel's heir would bear undeniable proof of his heritage in his very face. "I'm not here to stop your wedding," Isabella continued, her voice softening as she turned back to Marlon. "God knows I don't want to marry someone who could abandon his child before even knowing of its existence. I'm here because this baby deserves to know the truth about his father's choice. He deserves to know that when the moment came to choose between love and money, his father chose wealth without even a backward glance." Clara, who had been standing statue still throughout this revelation, suddenly moved. Her perfectly manicured hand reached up to her $1,000 veil, slowly pulling it back from her face. Her expression wasn't one of anger or humiliation, as many might have expected. Instead, her blue eyes held a dawning understanding, as if puzzle pieces were finally clicking into place. "The morning sickness," Clara said, her voice carrying clearly through the hushed cathedral. "When you were helping your mother cater events last summer, it wasn't food poisoning at all, was it?" Isabella shook her head, a sad smile touching her lips. "I didn't want to lie to you, Clara. You were always kind to me, to my mother. That's why I couldn't let you marry him without knowing the truth. You deserve better than a man who would deny his own child." The wedding planner, having recovered from her faint, was furiously typing on her phone, no doubt trying to contain the social media explosion that was already beginning. Several guests had their phones raised, live streaming the drama to millions of followers. The Samuels family's carefully cultivated public image was unraveling in real time. "My mother," Marlon finally spoke, his voice hoarse with emotion. "She threatened to destroy your career, your mother's future. And you believed her?" Isabella's laugh held no humor. "Did you think I was so weak? Did you think all those years of fighting to become a doctor, of proving myself despite every obstacle, meant nothing? Your mother's threats were just that. Threats. Empty ones, as it turns out." She reached into her small purse and withdrew a letter, the paper crisp and official. "I'm chief resident at Boston General now, Marlon. My research on prenatal care in underserved communities is being published next month. Your mother's influence doesn't extend as far as she thinks it does. Some doors can't be closed by even the wealthiest hands." Victoria stood abruptly, her designer heels clicking on the marble floor, as she strode toward Isabella. But before she could reach her, Charles Samuels did something he hadn't done in 40 years of marriage. He stopped his wife with a firm hand on her arm. "Enough, Victoria." His voice carried the weight of decades of silent observation. "Look at what your manipulations have wrought. Our grandchild will be born into a world of bitterness and division because of your pride." The assembled guests watched in shock as Charles Samuels, the man who had built an empire but allowed his wife to rule their family life with an iron fist, finally took a stand. He turned to Isabella, his eyes, the same distinctive green eyes she had mentioned, filling with tears. "My dear," he said softly, "I hope you'll allow me to know my grandson, despite our family's grievous errors." Isabella's hand trembled as she reached into her purse again, withdrawing a sonogram image. "He, due in 6 weeks," she said, her voice gentler now. "He's healthy, strong, and yes, Mr. Samuels, he has your eyes." The photograph passed from hand to hand, making its way through the stunned crowd. Those who saw it couldn't help but notice the clear profile, the familiar nose that graced every Samuel's male for 4 generations. "I kept every prenatal appointment," Isabella continued, her words now directed at the entire assembly. "I wrote in a journal every day, documenting every kick, every hiccup, every moment of his development. I did this not for myself, but for him, so that one day, when he asks about his father, I can tell him that even though his father chose not to be part of his story, he was loved and wanted from the very first moment." The weight of her words settled over the cathedral like a heavy blanket. Several of the society matrons who had once looked down their noses at the housekeeper's daughter were now openly weeping. The bishop, forgotten in the drama, crossed himself quietly. "The truth," Isabella said, her voice growing stronger with each word, "is that I'm not here to destroy anyone's perfect day. I'm here because lies destroy more than truth ever could. I'm here because every child deserves to know their story, even when that story isn't the one their parents would have chosen to write." She turned to leave, her head held high, but paused at the foot of the altar. Reaching down, she picked up the wedding program that had fallen from someone's hands. The elaborate paper, with its gold embossing and carefully chosen fonts, bore the words, "Two families united in love." "Love," Isabella said softly, letting the program fall back to the marble floor. "Love isn't about threats or ultimatums. It isn't about family names or merger deals. Real love is about choices, and we all have to live with the choices we make." As she walked back down the aisle, her steps measured and dignified, the cathedral remained in stunned silence. The truth had been unveiled, and in its wake, nothing would ever be the same for the Samuels family again. The perfect society wedding had become something else entirely, a moment of reckoning, a public unmasking of private sins, and perhaps most surprisingly, the beginning of a different kind of love story. Not the one printed in the expensive programs, but one that would reshape the lives of everyone present in ways that no amount of wealth or social standing could have predicted. The unexpected ally, Clara Agnes, stood at the altar, her $1,000 bouquet trembling in her manicured hands as the weight of truth settled over the cathedral. Time seemed to slow as her mind raced through every strange moment of her 6-month engagement to Marlon. The whispered name Bella in his sleep, the way he avoided certain parts of the mansion's gardens, his strange reaction to pregnant women at charity events. The perfect society. Bride watched Isabella's tears fall on the cathedral's marble floor, each droplet seeming to wash away another layer of the elaborate lie she'd been living. In that moment, Clara felt something inside her shift. Not breaking, as many might have expected, but awakening. Her thoughts flashed to a memory from 3 months ago. She had found Marlon in his study, staring at his phone with such raw pain that it made her heart ache. When she'd asked what was wrong, he'd quickly closed a news article about Boston General Hospital's groundbreaking prenatal care program. Now, that small moment clicked into place like the final piece of a puzzle she hadn't known she was solving. The cathedral buzzed with whispers and the subtle clicks of phone cameras. Clara could practically see the social media storm brewing, could imagine the headlines that would grace tomorrow's papers. Her own mother, Evelyn Agnes, had already pressed a hand to her chest, no doubt calculating the social damage to their shipping empire's reputation. But as Clara looked at Isabella, really looked at her, she saw past the drama of the moment to the strength it must have taken to walk into this cathedral. She saw a woman who had achieved her dreams despite every obstacle, who had carried not just a child, but the burden of truth for months without buckling. "Stop!" Clara's voice rang out, surprising even herself with its clarity. The whispers ceased immediately. Every eye in the cathedral turned from Isabella to her, expecting perhaps a bride's outraged response to this disruption of her perfect day. Instead, Clara carefully set down her bouquet on the altar steps. The action, simple yet decisive, seemed to echo through the vast space. She turned to face the assembled guests, her Vera Wang gown rustling like whispered confessions. "All my life," she began, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands, "I've been taught that appearances matter above all else. That the right marriage, the right connections, the right photo opportunities could build empires stronger than steel or concrete." Victoria Samuels half rose from her seat, but Clara's next words froze her in place. "But looking at you, Isabella, I see something my finishing school never taught me about. Real strength, real dignity, and I refuse to build my life's foundation on someone else's lies." Clara stepped down from the altar, her movements deliberate. The train of her designer gown whispered across the marble floor as she walked to Isabella. The contrast between them was stark. The society bride in her elaborate white gown and the pregnant doctor in her simple blue dress. Yet somehow they seemed to mirror each other in their dignity. "You tried to tell me, didn't you?" Clara asked softly. "That day in the garden, when you were helping your mother with the engagement party. You started to say something, but Mrs. Samuels interrupted with the champagne toast." Isabella nodded, fresh tears spilling down her cheeks. "I couldn't bear the thought of you building your life on a lie. You were always kind to me, to my mother. You deserved to know the truth." Clara turned to Marlon, who stood frozen at the altar, his face a mask of conflicting emotions. "All those nights you called her name in your sleep, I told myself it was just wedding stress. I convinced myself that your distance was normal, that your mother's constant presence at our events was just family devotion." Her laugh held no bitterness, only a strange sort of relief. "Do you know what the saddest part is? I was already planning how to be the perfect society wife, how to ignore the signs of your unhappiness, just like my mother taught me to do with my father's indiscretions." The assembled guests shifted uncomfortably. Several society matrons avoided meeting each other's eyes, too many of them recognizing their own carefully maintained facades, in Clara's words. "But I won't do it," Clara continued, her voice growing stronger. "I won't spend my life pretending not to notice when you stare at our children, wondering if they'll have your family's green eyes. I won't lie awake at night, knowing there's another woman raising your firstborn son while we play happy families for the shareholders." She reached for Isabella's hand, an action that caused audible gasps from the front pews. "Your mother threatened to destroy Isabella's career if she didn't disappear from your life. But she never bothered to threaten me, did she? After all, what society bride would ever side with her replacement's pregnant predecessor?" Victoria Samuels stood, her face tight with barely contained rage. "Clara, dear, you're obviously overwhelmed. Let's take a moment to—" "To what, Mrs. Samuels?" Clara's smile was razor-sharp. "To discuss how to spin this, to plan which reporters to buy off, to decide how many zeros to write on a check to make this go away." She turned to face the older woman fully. "But you can't buy off genetics, can you? You can't threaten DNA into submission. That baby will be born with your family's eyes, and no amount of money or social influence can change that." Clara reached up and removed her veil, the delicate lace worth thousands floating to the floor like discarded illusions. "The Agnes shipping fleet might be valuable to your empire, Mrs. Samuels, but my soul is worth more, and I choose not to sell it for a place in your family's carefully curated lie." She turned back to Isabella, whose expression held a mixture of gratitude and astonishment. "You're chief resident at Boston General now?" At Isabella's nod, Clara's smile became genuine. "My family's foundation has been looking to fund an expansion of prenatal care programs in underserved communities. Perhaps we should discuss this over coffee, somewhere far from the Samuels family's influence." The implications of this alliance, between the shipping heiress and the doctor who should have been her nemesis, rippled through the cathedral like a shockwave. Victoria Samuels sank back into her pew, understanding that she had finally overplayed her hand. Her perfectly orchestrated world was crumbling, not from the scandal she had feared, but from the unexpected integrity of the very woman she had chosen to help maintain her family's facade. "The cars waiting outside," Clara announced to the stunned congregation, "will now be taking guests to the Four Seasons, where they can enjoy what would have been our wedding reception. Consider it a celebration of truth rather than marriage." She looked at Isabella's prominent baby bump and smiled. "Though perhaps we should avoid the champagne toast." The unexpected laugh that rippled through the cathedral broke the last of the tension. As guests began to move, Clara took Isabella's arm. "Come on. I think we both deserve a cup of tea and a very long conversation about the future of maternal health care in Boston." As the two women walked down the aisle together, their steps matched despite their different circumstances. The whispers behind them changed from scandal to something like respect. They had just witnessed not just the end of a society wedding, but the beginning of an alliance that would reshape more than just one family's legacy. Victoria Samuels watched them go, her perfectly controlled world slipping through her fingers like the grains of rice that would never be thrown at this wedding. Behind her, Charles Samuels finally allowed himself to smile, seeing in this unexpected outcome a chance for his family to build something more valuable than mere empire: authenticity. The bridge chooses. The tension in the air of the Cathedral of St. Patrick's was palpable, as Clara Agnes' declaration sent shockwaves rippling through the sea of guests. The collective gasp from the crowd seemed to hang in the air, interwoven with the vibrant rays of sunlight filtering through the stained glass windows. Every guest, from the former presidents to the society elite, froze, eyes glued to the unfolding drama. Clara, the picture of composure despite the tremble in her fingertips, turned fully to face the congregation. Her gown, a masterpiece of ivory silk and intricate lace, swept the polished marble floor as she descended the altar steps. Each step was deliberate, purposeful, echoing loudly in the cavernous space as if punctuating her words. "I can't do this," she repeated, her voice growing firmer, more resolute. "I cannot be part of a family that destroys love for the sake of appearances, that uses power to crush lives rather than uplift them. And I will not marry a man who abandoned his own child before it was even born." Gasps and murmurs erupted anew, the carefully maintained composure of the guests finally breaking. The sound of whispered judgments and hurried taps on smartphones filled the cathedral as Clara stopped before Isabella Angel, her gown's train pooling around her like a vanquished kingdom. Isabella's dark eyes brimmed with unshed tears, her hands instinctively cradling her swollen belly as she looked up at Clara. The contrast between them, one a vision of wealth and privilege, the other of quiet resilience and strength, was stark, yet they mirrored each other in an unexpected display of dignity. "You told me the truth when no one else would," Clara continued, her voice softer now, but no less determined. "You had every reason to walk away and let me fall into this trap, but instead, you stood here, in front of all these people, and told me what I deserved to know. For that, I owe you not anger, but gratitude." Isabella's lips parted in surprise, but before she could respond, Clara reached out and took her hand, lifting it so the entire congregation could see. "This woman," Clara declared, her voice carrying the weight of her resolve, "is braver than anyone else in this room. She has fought for her dreams, her child, and the truth, all without the wealth and privilege the rest of us take for granted. And today, I choose to stand with her, not against her." Victoria Samuels, her icy composure slipping for the first time, rose from her seat, her voice a sharp whisper of command. "Clara, sit down this instant. You are humiliating yourself and this family." But Clara turned, her expression unflinching as she faced the formidable matriarch. "You made this bed, Mrs. Samuels," she said, her words cutting through the air like a blade. "And now you're going to lie in it. You built an empire on lies and manipulation, but you won't use me as another pawn in your game." A stunned silence followed as Victoria sank back into her seat, her face a mask of barely concealed fury. Clara turned her attention back to Marlon, who stood frozen at the altar, his expression a mixture of guilt, disbelief, and something dangerously close to shame. "You once told me that love was about partnership," Clara said, her tone steady but her gaze unyielding. "But you proved that your idea of love is submission, to your mother, to your legacy, to everything except the truth. I deserve better. Isabella deserves better, and so does your son." At the mention of his child, Marlon flinched, his green eyes glancing briefly at Isabella before darting away, unable to meet her gaze. The weight of his choices, or lack thereof, seemed to crush him where he stood. Clara, satisfied that her message had been received, turned back to Isabella. "You deserve a voice," she said simply, "not just for yourself, but for your son. And I'm going to make sure you have it." Taking Isabella's arm gently, Clara led her back down the aisle, the two women walking side by side, their steps synchronized despite the heavy weight of their circumstances. As they passed the guests, the whispers grew louder, cameras flashing as the spectacle of the day took an unexpected, empowering turn. Near the cathedral's grand doors, Clara paused, turning one last time to address the room. "To everyone here," she said, her voice clear and strong, "remember this moment. Remember that wealth and power mean nothing if they come at the expense of humanity and integrity. And remember that sometimes the bravest thing you can do is walk away." With that, she pushed open the heavy wooden doors, letting in the afternoon sunlight and a rush of fresh air. Together, Clara and Isabella stepped into the light, leaving behind the weight of societal expectations and stepping toward an uncertain but honest future. The doors closed behind them with a resounding thud, leaving the stunned congregation to grapple with the wreckage of the Samuels family's perfect facade. Inside, Victoria sat rigid, her carefully orchestrated world crumbling around her. But outside, Clara and Isabella stood tall, their heads high, their hands clasped in solidarity. In that moment, they were not just survivors, they were architects of their own destiny. A new beginning. 3 months after the dramatic events of the Samuels' wedding, Isabella gave birth to a beautiful baby boy. The delivery room was filled with quiet joy, the kind that comes not from grand gestures or wealth, but from the simple, profound miracle of new life. The nurses cooed over the baby, noting the striking green eyes he had inherited, a silent testament to his lineage. At the hospital, Isabella was surprised to find an arrangement of fresh lilies and daisies waiting for her. Attached to the bouquet was a handwritten note. "For the bravest woman I know, may your strength inspire generations to come. Clara." Clara had kept her promise. Not only had she reached out to support Isabella emotionally, but she had also founded a scholarship program aimed at helping single mothers pursue medical degrees. The program was already changing lives, giving women like Isabella the chance to balance their dreams with the demands of motherhood. Meanwhile, Marlon lingered in the hospital corridor, unsure of his place in this new chapter. Stripped of his inheritance after standing up to his mother, he had spent the past months re-evaluating his life. He knew Isabella's trust was a bridge long burned, but he hoped, at the very least, to be a father to his son. Through the nursery window, Marlon gazed at the tiny baby in the crib marked with his surname. The child stirred, yawning, his little fists clenched in a way that filled Marlon with an emotion he couldn't quite name, something between hope and regret. As Marlon stood lost in thought, Clara passed by on her way to Isabella's room. She paused beside him, her expression soft but resolute. "Sometimes losing everything," she said quietly, "is the only way to find out who you really are." Her words hung in the air, a mix of challenge and encouragement. Without waiting for a response, Clara continued down the hallway, her steps confident and unhurried. She entered Isabella's room with a warm smile, greeted by the sight of her new friend cradling her newborn. The two women, once rivals, had built an unbreakable bond born from shared heartbreak and a mutual desire for a better future. Marlon, left behind in the corridor, felt the weight of Clara's words. For the first time, he realized that redemption wouldn't come from grand gestures or even his attempts to rewrite the past. It would come from consistency, humility, and the choices he made moving forward, starting with being present for his son. In Isabella's room, the atmosphere was filled with laughter and quiet hope. Clara gently took the baby in her arms, marveling at his tiny features. "He's perfect," she said, her voice filled with genuine admiration. Isabella smiled, her eyes tired but glowing. "He's my reason to keep fighting," she replied softly. In that moment, the two women exchanged a glance that needed no words. They had both lost so much, but they had gained something even greater: clarity, purpose, and an unwavering belief in their own strength. As the sun set over the hospital, casting a warm glow across the city, it was clear that love had won. Not in the traditional sense of romance or fairy tale endings, but in the form of self-discovery, new beginnings, and the quiet triumph of resilience. Together, they had created a legacy not of wealth or power, but of hope and transformation, proof that even shattered lives could give birth to something extraordinary. Dear readers, this story reminds us that life's most powerful moments often come from unexpected truths and the courage to stand for what is right. Love isn't always about grand gestures or perfect endings. Sometimes it's about finding strength in adversity, forging unexpected bonds, and choosing integrity over convenience. As you step away from these pages, may you carry with you the belief that even in the face of heartbreak, there is always a chance for redemption, growth, and a brighter tomorrow. Stay brave, stay hopeful, and remember, every ending is just the beginning of a new story.